The tent flap tore open before I heard footsteps, and a human stood in it holding another human under each arm and two more slung across his back, and I remember thinking, before anything else, that the math of that was wrong. One body, carried correctly, taxes a healthy frame. 4 bodies should have put him on the ground a kilometer back. He set them down. Not dropped, a set, one at a time, in the order I would later understand was triage order, the worst wounded first. Then he said, 11 didn't make it, and sat down on the floor of my tent like a man finishing a long but ordinary shift. I am Vale Astrinia, Senior Field Surgeon, Corvette Expeditionary Medical Corps. I have run triage on 9 species across 6 campaigns. I had never run it on him. I scanned the 4 he'd carried first, because that was the job, and then I scanned him, because something about the way he was sitting bothered me. The reader gave me a blood volume estimate and I assumed the unit was malfunctioning, because the number it gave said he should have lost consciousness roughly 2 hours earlier and entered terminal circulatory collapse perhaps 40 minutes after that. He was sitting upright, answering my questions, asking after the 4 men he'd just set down. Recalibrate, I told my technician. She recalibrated. The number came back the same. I want to be precise about what that number meant, because precision is the only thing I have ever trusted. Across every charted species in the Corps' registry, 1100 and some, last count, there is a shared curve. You lose blood, your body compensates, heart rate climbs, vessels constrict, you stay upright a while past where you should. Then the compensation fails all at once, in every species we have ever measured, in the same order, blood pressure collapses, consciousness goes, organs follow in a cascade that does not reverse itself without intervention within minutes. It is not a difference of degree between species. It is a wall. Every species we have ever put a reader on hits it. He had been past that wall for over 2 hours, and during those 2 hours he had killed 3 of the unit that ambushed his squad, carried 4 wounded men across 9 kilometers of broken ridge terrain in the dark, and found my tent without instruments, by memory of a route he'd walked once, in daylight, 6 days before. How? I asked him. I am not proud of how flat my voice was. It is the only way I know how to ask a question I am afraid of the answer to. He looked at his hands like he hadn't really thought about it. You keep moving until you're done moving, he said. Then you stop. That was not an answer. I have since decided it was the only true one available to him. Before any of that, I made him tell me what had happened to the unit, because a surgeon who doesn't understand the wound is guessing at the treatment. The listening post had been 15 souls on a ridge they were never meant to defend, watching a supply corridor that wasn't supposed to matter. The attack came in the dark, fast, more numbers than the post's perimeter sensors had logged in the hour before. He told it without embellishment, the way a man recites a route he has walked enough times to stop seeing the scenery. 11 of his squad were gone within the first 6 minutes. 4 were down but breathing. He did not describe deciding to carry them. He described it as the next thing that needed doing, in the same tone he'd later used to tell me the road had run out underneath him. I requisitioned his full readout that night and ran it against the registry myself, alone, because I did not yet want anyone else's panic mixed with my own confusion. What I found was not a tolerance. Tolerance implies a body absorbing damage and continuing despite it, the way armor absorbs a blow. What his body was doing was closer to triage performed internally, automatically, without him directing it, a shunt. Blood flow to the skin, the gut, the kidneys, all of it throttled down to nearly nothing, while flow to the heart muscle, the brain, and whatever skeletal muscle he was actively using stayed protected, defended, prioritized as if by a second surgeon working inside him who had already decided what could be sacrificed and what could not. Every other species we have measured tries to defend everything at once when the volume drops, and fails everywhere at once when it can no longer afford to. His body had apparently decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that most of itself was expendable and a narrow corridor of function was not, and it had defended that corridor with a stubbornness that did not care what the textbooks said should already have killed him. I brought the readout to Battalion Surgeon Thren the next morning. He is not a man who startles easily. I have watched him set a compound fracture without changing his breathing rate. He looked at the chart for a long time and then asked me the same thing I had asked the human. How is he not dead? He doesn't appear to know either, I said. He described it as moving until he was done moving. Thren asked the question I should have asked first. What happens when they're not done? When there's no 4 wounded men left to carry and no 9 kilometers left to walk and the moving just stops being possible? I didn't have that answer, so I went and found him again. He was on a cot in the recovery section, transfusion line in, sleeping the deep unbroken sleep of a man whose body had finally been given permission to stop defending the corridor and start repairing everything else. I sat beside him until he woke, which took 6 hours, and when he did, the first thing he asked, before his own condition, before the men he'd carried, was whether the 4 had made it. I told him 3 had. He absorbed that the way I imagine he absorbed everything, which is to say without performance, without the bracing I expect from a man receiving bad news. He simply nodded, once, like a number going into a ledger. I asked him, this time more carefully, what it had felt like, the 2 hours past where his body should have failed. It felt like running out of road, he said. You don't decide to keep going. There's just road, and then there isn't, and somewhere in the middle you stop noticing which one you're on. I have run that line through every translation matrix we own, trying to find the part of it that was metaphor and the part that was description, and I have come to believe it was entirely description. He was not being brave. He was not overriding fear or pain through will, the way our own training literature describes courage, a conscious choice repeated against resistance. He had simply not yet arrived at the place where the choice mattered, because something underneath the choosing part of him had already made the decision for the whole body and did not consult him on the timeline. I filed the report that night. I wrote, as plainly as I could manage, that the species does not fail the way every other species we have catalogued fails, that the collapse curve we have used for 1100 species does not apply, that there may be no clean way to predict, from blood loss alone, when a human stops being able to act, because the variable that determines it is not volume but task, whether there is still a wounded man, still 9 kilometers, still a tent he remembers from 6 days ago. Take those away and I do not know what happens. Leave them in place and I have watched, with my own readers, on my own table, a man carry 4 others for 2 hours after every chart in this corps says he should already have been a body for someone else to carry. Command's response came back within the day, 3 lines, unusually short for them. Reclassify casualty assessment protocol for human personnel, pending further data. Suspend blood volume thresholds as predictive of incapacitation in human subjects until further notice. File under priority review. I added a 4th line myself, off the record, in my own copy of the file, because someone should write down the part that isn't procedure. He asked after the 4th man again 3 days later, before he asked about his own discharge date. I told him the 4th hadn't made it either, in the end. He went quiet for a moment, and then he said, he was the one I should have grabbed first, and nothing else, and I understood that whatever had let him walk past the point his own body should have ended him, it had not made the carrying easier. It had only made it possible. That is the part of the file I keep coming back to. Not that he survived past the wall. That on the other side of it, he was still doing the arithmetic of who he hadn't been fast enough to save.